More than 1,480 men, women, and children arrived on the shores of Botany Bay on January 24, 1788. They came on 11 ships, each no bigger than a ferry. These ships were known as the First Fleet. But, according to Davidson and Noble, in their 1992 study, the first colonization of Australia happened about 60,000 years prior. The indigenous people of Australia have been inhabiting the once terra nullius, that is the continent, long before the British arrived. This topic of colonization has been one of contention since the First Fleet arrived in 1788. It has led to centuries of conflict, displacement, uprooting, and dispossession for the indigenous population. To this day, indigenous people face the consequences of European colonization of Australia. The use of art as a form of communication and understanding by indigenous Australians, whether modern or traditional, has been a long-time means for them to display feelings, thoughts, and opinions regarding strong issues and ways for indigenous people to express their identity and indigeneity. The colonization of Australia is one of the many topics that have been explored by indigenous artists. Good morning. My name is Mohammed Hassen, and I will be discussing and analyzing the expression of colonization through indigenous art. The generational compounding of trauma, dispossession, and disadvantage that indigenous Australians have faced in the last 2 centuries still has a lasting impact on the indigenous population today. Colonial initiatives like missions have led to a vicious cycle of trauma, displacement, poor health, leading directly to generational poverty and lack of education in some communities. The goal of missions were to civilize, Christianize, and educate indigenous people. But in reality, they were the first steps to a lifelong time of exploitation and slavery. Violence and child removal are some of the biggest contributors to trauma in indigenous communities, and according to Dudgeon, Milroy, and Walker, people who have experienced trauma are more likely to involve themselves in self-destructive behavior, have poorer health, higher incarceration rates, and lower education levels than those that have not. These consequences are all direct results of colonization and all the aftermath that came with it. The statistics show a significant gap in results and retention in indigenous students. Non-indigenous Australians have a rate of over 70% for Year 12 completion, whereas indigenous Australians are barely scraping in at 40%. This ties in again with employment, self-destructive behavior, and incarceration. The ABS in 2008 showcases that people with higher education are less likely to have these tendencies than people who do not have completed Year 10 or Year 12. This can be again linked back to generational trauma and the repercussions of colonialism on indigenous Australians. Today I'll be using a modern piece of art to demonstrate the experiences of trauma and disadvantage that indigenous people have faced due to colonization. The art form I have chosen is lino-cut printing, which is a form of press printing made using linoleum flooring. It involves carving out a design on a piece of linoleum and using ink to press it out onto paper. The art piece is called Colonizing Species by Kevin Gilbert. Kevin Gilbert was an award-winning playwright, author, and artist, and faced many of the adversities that I have already mentioned. Incarceration and lack of education, to be specific. Gilbert spent 13 years in prison and only received Year 4 as his highest education. However, in prison he educated himself by reading dictionaries from cover to cover, and he learnt lino-cut art techniques. This painting, Colonizing Species, is a deep reflection of the impact of colonization on indigenous Australians from Gilbert. Looking at the painting, there is a black swan, a native animal to Australia, with its neck cut, being bitten by a white swan. This represents the power struggle between indigenous and European people and indicates that the colonizers had more of the power. The black swan is bleeding out onto a crown, the crown representing the British Empire and Gilbert indicating that they are responsible for the death of the swan. It also represents the blood that the British Empire has on its hands through the violent and inhumane treatment of the indigenous Australians. The swans are the crown, and the crown are superimposed on an Aboriginal flag, the red bottom made from the spilled blood of the swan. This shows the struggle that indigenous people had to go through to finally gain an identity in Australia. Blood had to be spilled for them to retain their culture and self as indigenous people. The black half of the flag is covered in Aboriginal motifs. Although they are indistinct for the most part, there is a wangina, which is an anthropomorphic figure with an aura, Art is an important part of indigeneity and expressing it. Important messages and concepts of knowledge and life would not have been passed down today if it wasn't for the use of art.